Hello, everybody. Welcome along to the Event Industry News Podcast with me, James Dixon, broadcasting from home and wishing everybody, as always, a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever or wherever you join today's podcast from. And welcome along to today's show and welcome along to today's guest. Let's cut straight to his high-tech, super fancy studio. And we welcome to the podcast for the first time, Mr. Anthony Vade. Anthony is the director over in North America for the Event Design Collective GmbH. Anthony, a very warm welcome to the Event Industry News Podcast.
Thanks, James. It's great to be here. I've been really enjoying all your content, so it's an honor to add to that, hopefully.
Absolutely. I'm bringing a very international flavour to the podcast today, Anthony. Tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, where you're from, what your background is, and where you're joining the podcast today from.
Oh, it's a long and storied history. This may be an entire podcast just in and of itself. But originally, I've got a strange accent, as many people notice. Originally from Australia, spent about half of my career in the events industry down under, running shows in for a couple of great companies down there. Started out in the theater, got into concert touring and music festivals, helped a company down there build out their corporate portfolio as well from an event production standpoint. Then I immigrated to Canada, where I've been for the last 10 years, sort of traversing the Canadian market, some time in Vancouver. Now I'm based in Toronto. Worked for some very large audiovisual companies, helping them with from a sales perspective and a technical direction perspective, putting on lots of different kinds of shows for lots of different kinds of stakeholders. And over the last few years, I've really moved into the design field, got involved with the Event Design Collective while I was working for an AV company. Spent a lot of years developing that with them. And at the start of this year, shifted my focus 100% to the Event Design Collective. And we basically champion the event canvas design methodology to allow event professionals and event owners to communicate on a more level playing field, understand each other deeper, connect with their stakeholders in an intimate way, and by deploying the methodology in our form of design thinking, get better outcomes for their stakeholders at their events, more measurable outcomes, and better team cohesion so that we build stronger bonds and stronger relationships through event experiences.
And that event canvas design methodology is something, well, I've scribbled down immediately because I know that that's clearly something that straight away our listeners are going to be screaming at, down their phones saying, well, what is it? What is that you've just said? So we'll get into that. Something else that I wanted to ask, and for anybody who's watching the video of today's podcast on eventindustrynews.com, after your name, it says CED. Maybe not a job title, that the people are familiar with. Tell us a little bit what that actually stands for and how it came to be.
Yeah, so CED stands for Certified Event Designer. One of the things that developed through the history of the event canvas and the methodology was we recognized that it's all well and good to have one, but you also need to educate people on it. And you need to be able to recognize when people have a competency level to really deploy the methodology that you can trust and rely upon. So a lot like there are CMM, certified meeting managers, or certified CMP, certified meeting professionals, CSEP, certified special event professionals. The CED designation, certified event designer, is a way of identifying those who understand the event canvas design methodology, how to deploy it to a competency level that they are capable of facilitating the methodology, not just understanding it, but actually being champions and leading other people through the design process with that level of competency as well. So we partnered with the Event Industry Council, the EIC, who also takes care of several other industry designations, sort of as an oversight body. And they worked with us to create the Certified Event Designer designation so that we could then recognize people. We have about 500 CEDs around the world, and it truly is global, all over the place. And we've had about 3,700 or thereabouts people go through some form of training and are on their road to eventually attain their CED.
And something that our keen-eared listeners will have picked up on when I introduced at the very beginning is that it's the Event Design Collective GmbH, which anybody who knows their business suffixes knows that that's a German company. So the history clearly of the business is in Europe and in Germany, if I'm right in assuming that. Tell us how how this methodology then began presumably in Germany, and how it's then grown into where you are now in Toronto over in Canada.
Actually funny, it didn't develop originally in Germany despite the business title, and it's actually headquartered in Switzerland.
Right.
And to make it even more complicated, if that wasn't enough for you, the founders who developed the methodology are from the Netherlands.
I love this already.
Yeah, so we truly is a global organization. And I'll give you a real quick background. Three very, very intelligent and forward-thinking individuals, Rolf Friesen, Ruud Janssen, and Dennis Lara, identified in the sort of early 2010s that there was no real defined design methodologies specifically for the events industry. Everybody kind of did their own thing, right? We had creative organizations that had some forms of design thinking. They were all some were using business model generation, a bunch of different stuff out there, but nobody had really cracked the code for designing events using design thinking. So they started looking around and researching. They spent many years looking at all the different methodologies that exist out in the world, and started to think, okay, which bits of these fit our industry? How can we adapt and to develop? And they're very, very inspired by business model generation and the guys from Strategizer who have the business model canvas. They saw that, and we've got to be able to crack this and do this for the events industry. And so they spent a lot of time prototyping, like all great designers do. And what came out of that was the event canvas, the single sheeter that allows you to communicate through 3 phases of design, to understand the change that you're trying to create with your events, to define the framework and the constraint that you need to design within, and then start designing with time. Start looking at experience journeys and instructional design. And started testing it and started rolling it out with a bunch of different clients around the world to design events. And then that led to them honing it and perfecting it. And it's constantly evolving. I tell you, it's very different to 2014 when they first launched it, because good prototyping, things evolve. But around 2015, they recognized that it's great to have a piece of paper, but you need a way to explain it to people. So they released the Event Design Handbook.
Yeah.
The step-by-step process for using the event canvas, and also works to define the language of event design and how do we talk about event design and how do we communicate with our stakeholders.
And I should point out to anybody who's listening to today's podcast, go over to eventindustrynews.com and just have a little look at the video, because we've got some great visuals. Anthony's been holding up the book that is just referenced, the manual is just referenced, but also in the background you'll see the event canvas that he's just been talking about. So it's well worth, if you're listening to today's podcast, to just hop onto the website and check out the video version as well, because a lot of what we're talking about will be put into perspective. Something that sprung out at me straight away was when you said that they spent time developing and refining and perfecting. And it's the word perfecting that leapt out at me then, because whilst this is clearly a great method that's been developed in order to aid the design process for event organizers, can you ever really perfect it, or is it just a constant ongoing refinement process?
Yeah, it's I mean, like everything that's of purpose or meaning, right? We're trying to bring about change. So we're trying to change the way that people design events for more intentional, more purposeful outcomes. And when you're designing things for human beings change constantly too. So when in any time that and this is something that's deep in me, and what drew me to the methodology specifically is we're constantly revisiting and say, okay, what's changed in the world? What's changed in the way people approach events? What's changed in the event ecosystem in general? Like, obviously, we've had the biggest change our industry's ever seen in the history of the industry over the last 18 months. And I just coughed, which is kind of, I don't know if that was or something, but we recognize that it's not the same as it was, and the only constant in life is change, and you need to be ready to adapt and to evolve with that. So the methodology, although we trust the system and the process that's been put in place, it's always open to looking at ourselves again and going, okay, what's changed in the world? How do we adapt to this? What still is true and absolute in the methodology? And then how can we make sure that if we do create any changes to the system or the process, it does have long-term, long-reaching benefits, not just appeasing short-term wants?
Absolutely. So, just to give people a bit of insight as well into maybe reveal some of the magic that happens in the background when we put these podcasts together, is that I will always, receive emails and exchange some messages with the guest in advance with some potential talking points, and something that again jumped out at me, Anthony, when we looked at some talking points ahead of today, was a point that you said were facing the challenge of the events and tech mindsets collision.
Yeah.
Now that jumped out at me, I suppose, for a number of reasons, most of which I guess will be obvious to a lot of people listening to this podcast, is that there has been that collision, particularly in the last 12 months, between live events and tech. Event operators, and particularly people who've so deeply embedded in the live event production world, who've suddenly been faced with using technology as a means to deliver events that they've never done before. There has been a huge collision there, and I was wondering if you could just maybe expand a little bit on what you meant by that as a particular talking point, and some of the issues that people are actually facing at the moment when it comes to that events and tech collision.
Yeah, and it's an interesting time, and we've spent a lot of time in the Event Design Collective thinking about this, and we talk a lot about digital dexterity and how the industry was forced to up their digital dexterity. The Event Design Collective, as a global organization, everybody remote working, was in digital space long before the pandemic forced us into it. So we were kind of already living in that mindset a bit. But what we noticed, it was really hard to get people into a Zoom meeting back then.
Yeah,
Because they never downloaded it, they never accessed it. So that's been an interesting part, to see that forced collision of the event planners and the event owners adopting a digital first mindset. But what
yeah,
we saw in that collision was the difference between the two industry segments and the way that they think about, in particular, offerings to the market. So the example I like to give in the event tech space, and in tech in general, the idea of design thinking, agile development, rapid prototyping, and the evil minimal viable product, is and that's what drives forward the tech world. Like, the minimal
yeah,
viable product, get it to market, get it out there quick, get people using it, find the bugs and the flaws, fix them, and iterate again and put out another product. Now, event planners, event producers, even, and certainly event owners, that's very foreign concept for them. They like, I use the word, and now I really regret it, perfection. Um,
yeah,
they like, flawless execution, they hold themselves to. Now, I think they're bullshitting themselves most of the time, because I've done thousands of shows, and I cannot I can, maybe one was close to flawless. I mean,
Mhm.
I knew things went wrong backstage that no one else saw, but reality is, events are never totally flawless, and if they are, you're missing something. You
Yeah,
haven't seen the
yeah,
actual problem that existed. And I think we, as an events industry, in the collision, the problem that happened early in the 2010s came from people, one side of the industry, very comfortable with an MVP. Let's just get a new platform out there. Let's make sure that that platform is enough, and then let's fix it as the client use it. And
mhm,
instead, the planners coming and going, "What do you mean it's not complete? What do you mean there may be a chance of technology failing me? That's not acceptable. It needs to be flawless."
yeah,
And so we've had to bridge this gap, and I think it's a great opportunity for event professionals in general, and in particular the planner, to adopt this prototyping mindset, to go, okay, maybe I need to rein in what we're trying to achieve, minimize what I actually put out there, so minimal viable product, not trying
sure.
to do as much, but then test, measure, and iterate, and then and prototype. So because we believe events are never ending prototypes.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Where do you stand on levels of redundancy when it comes to tech? Because if you look at the live event scenario, for example, if I'm putting a wireless mic on a stand in the center of the stage, then I know for a fact that I've got a wired mic hidden underneath the monitor. So if that goes down, I can throw out a wired mic easy. That's my redundancy. That's my tech redundancy in a live event scenario. Have we overlooked at the moment having tech redundancy built into our planning? So we choose a platform to do something, and we hope that that's going to work, but we don't have any redundancy to have another platform built in somewhere. I appreciate there's a cost to that, but is tech redundancy something we should be looking into?
If the flawless execution is important to you, yes. And we've battled this in live production back way back before the pandemic too, right? And yeah, sure, we'd put that $25 microphone, wired microphone under the wedge. But as soon as I said to a client, by the way, you probably want hot backups of projectors, and I'll give them to you at 50% off so that we can make sure that if they fall down, it's immediately back up there. And the clients would say, oh, I can't afford that. Oh,
Yeah.
gee, well, they should be free because if the projector fails, then that's on you. Well, is it because you turned down the redundancy and the projector on the floor in the box, the cold backup, maybe that'll help us for the afternoon session, but you're still going to have a period that it's down. So that's part of the challenge in redundancy is who shares responsibility. It's been pretty one-sided as an industry, and I think it comes down to that mindset. There's this, and I don't want to get too deep into it because I get overly passionate, but we haven't been a cohesive industry. It's been a supplier and a buyer market, and there's been a power dynamic there that hasn't really enabled great collaboration and co-creation because of that competitiveness between the two mindsets. But I think redundancy, like I did a whole web series at the start of the pandemic for the company I was working for. Every single time we went live, we had the computers up and running. We were doing our streaming into the platform, and we all had our phones in front of us with an old dial-in number to a phone conference call line, so that if something went wrong with my microphone, they could quickly switch over to the conference call line. If my computer went down, at least they had audio to continue things through. So
yeah,
that's cheap. That's the $25 microphone sitting under your fallback wedge equivalent. And I think if we're not, I've noticed a lot of stop doing that. And if we want that flawless, then we need to be willing to invest a little bit in some of those forms of redundancy. Now, secondary streams, absolutely. Do we need extra redundancy? Probably not, because I think our audiences are a bit more forgiving than they've been in the past too when it comes to virtual events. And I think our platforms are more stable than they were in April or even March 2020. So do we need as much? No, but should we have something? Should we at least have a plan? Like, if I dropped out now, could James pick it up and wait and pad and fill things out until I got back online? Or there's ways outside of technology to be prepared for redundancy that don't necessarily mean adding to things. It just means designing for that moment and being, and as uncomfortable as it is to sit around a table or around an event canvas and say, what do we do when things go wrong? It's not a comfortable conversation to have. Having it before the moment happens is much more valuable than in the moment and panicking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been there, and sometimes you only learn to have those conversations because something has gone wrong, and you think, right, that needs to never happen again. How do we mitigate that in future?
Yeah.
You can forward plan problems and issues, but I've had it before. Awards events, video doesn't work, and it's got all of the nominees and shortlists built into that video. The video fails, and we realized there was no backup in the presenter's script for the presenter to maybe cover that failed video by actually reading aloud that particular category. We learned the next year we had a backup script on standby with a runner next to the stage ready to go. If a video failed, the backup script was there ready to go. Of course, once you have that backup, it never fails again, ever. But you will then always do it.
Yeah, and it's always a more uncomfortable conversation, and generally people run away from the conversations or try and shorten the conversations in post-mortem. After the things happened, everybody's super uncomfortable, and there's sometimes it's a bit combative. It's very easy after the fact to start pointing fingers and then run away from the conflict, because human beings don't like conflict. We like cohesion. We like to come together as communities. It's what let us evolve to where we are today. So as soon as that opportunity comes to start pointing fingers, the tech failed and it's your fault. We're not ready to then dissect exactly what happened. Whereas if we do that messy conversation in the front end before the problems occurred, how will we deal with this in the moment? There's better alignment and cohesion if and when the problem does come up, because you shared the redundant plan with each other ahead of time. It's going to be much. I mean, and I've forced conversations. We've had issues, with tech way back in events, because it happens. And we've gone into meetings with clients who have said, well, post-mortem, and our aim is to get a refund or to get money off of you for that problem. And then through talking through the problem, we've recognized that the responsibility was shared. That
Yeah.
it wasn't just the piece of equipment that went down, it was the planning we put into it, it was the design that we shared, it was them turning down the redundancy because of the cost or elements like that. And so through that difficult conversation, and it was really uncomfortable, we could get all that stuff out on the table and build back that mutual respect rather than it being a one-way dialogue that really widens the chasm between the buyer and the supplier, again compounding that division that I mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. I'd love to go back to the concept of the event canvas design methodology, because it fascinates me, and I'm constantly drawn to the picture just over your right hand shoulder, where we have an example of one of the event canvases on the wall there behind you. How difficult was it when creating this methodology to strike that balance between something that was detailed enough that offered a full insight into the event, but simple enough that anybody within the team could understand quickly? You mentioned 3 phases. How long or how difficult was the process to actually bring things down to 3 phases? Were there 5 to begin with that eventually, evolved and was streamlined down to 3? I'd love to know how you got it to the fine balance that it presumably took to get it to where it is today.
Yeah, so it's 3 phases and 14 blocks. So and the reason that we broke it down into 3 phases, and we could make the entire conversation about this, but the reason that it was broken down in such a way is because we recognize the different contributors, different people involved in events have different vantage points to how that event creates value. So the way that the owner sees the event versus those executing the event, the delivery team, is very different, and their perspective, their vantage point, and their sort of aims through that are different. And we need to address each of those levels of hierarchy within the event ecosystem in a unique way. So by breaking it down into 3 phases, not only could we guide the team through the steps within the process, we could also make sure that we developed the right narrative, the right story about how the event creates value for its stakeholders for each of those levels of hierarchy. So if we break down the 3 sections, because we won't have time to get into the 14 blocks,
Sure.
but if we break down the 3 sections, the bookends of the canvas, the 2 outside columns are referred to as the change. So we're talking about before the event occurs, how are the behaviors of those stakeholders as it relates to the event? What are they looking to achieve? What are they walking in? What is their emotional state? What are their goals before the event? And then on the opposite side, how do we aim to change those after the event? How are we transforming that stakeholder, the way they behave, the way they think, feel, say, and do things in the world? That kind of thinking, that sort of entering and exiting and change in behavior is really, really relevant and really important to the C-suite, to the senior executives in business and in organization. They're the ones with the long-term goals and the 10,000 feet thinking. They got the 5-10 year plans. If we move inside from the change bookends of the canvas, and we look at the sort of 2 blocks at the top, 2 blocks at the bottom, and the 2 triangles left and right, we call that the frame. And that stuff, that's really the constraint. What do we need to design within? What's the budget? What's the time? What does the event need to do for those stakeholders in order to create that behavior change? And what does it promise them? Why should they even get involved in the event? That's the stuff that really provides the limitation, but also the opportunity to hone in and craft in what change we can actually create. Managing frames and constraint is really important to people in middle management, the director level type people who are responsible for quarterly budgets, team performance elements, and they're reporting up to the executive that's got that 10,000 feet thinking, right? So in understanding those 2 elements, all of a sudden we can allow the executive to understand the director's perspective and vantage point a bit better. The last phase we call prototype, and I've already said, I already espoused the need for the industry to embrace prototyping. That prototyping is the hourglass, and there's a reason why it's an hourglass shape, because we believe that we are designing time worth being involved in, time worth contributing to in the event. So the top section is the experience journey, all the touch points you have with that stakeholder from the day you decide to have the event into the weeks, months, years, however long you project out afterwards. And the bottom part of the hourglass is the instructional design. if we're going to change their behaviors, we need to teach them something. We need to inform that change in behavior. And so by incorporating instructional design to experiential moments, we allow them to connect more intimately with that instruction and with that motivation and influence, so that then they can shift their behaviors and change them and achieve what the executive wanted. The hourglass and prototyping, I'm sure you're already guessing, and the listeners are already guessing, that's really important to the teams that are coordinating and putting the events together. That's their mark of success and their measurement through things. And it's also by understanding, communicating that prototype phase, and really when it comes down to actually designing the event, that enables them to communicate what they're doing, understand what's important to the directors, and then communicate back up to the senior executive about how what they're doing in the hourglass relates to creating the change that the organization needs.
And when you're talking about communication and going through these different levels of hierarchy within a client's organization, again, referring to some of the conversation points that you and I exchanged before this, you talk about conversations that matter and why a shared language is necessary for alignment and progression. And that shared language, I think, is a really interesting point, because I mean, a case in point, in the UK, we've had serious issues where government and people who are making decisions based on COVID restrictions, etc., didn't understand why a major festival had to cancel in January that wasn't due to take place in June. They didn't understand that it took 5 months to build the thing, that the guys putting up the fencing to create the perimeter around that greenfield location had to be on site in February in order to make that event happen in June. And to me, that's how I interpreted that point that you raised in email before today's podcast, was that, that level of understanding, that language, being able to communicate to people who maybe don't understand how an event works, why these elements are important and why, a budget needs to be actually assigned. So many people are still hesitant to actually give you their budget because they don't want you to know how much you've got to spend, because they're worried that you're going to go completely cavalier with their budget and bring ridiculous things in. But it's so important that they understand what you're talking about and why their communication back to you has to be clear as well.
I'll share a funny story with you. I went to a site inspection with a potential client way back. This is in the mid 2000s, and we turned up to the site. It was a big entertainment complex in Australia, and it was I'd had a couple of phone calls with the prospect, but I hadn't closed the business yet. So I went in and I asked that question, because every tech provider, every AV company loves hey, what's your budget? How much do I have to play with here? And I asked them, I asked them that very question. I probably wasn't gentle enough. I wasn't nurturing enough because I was young and reckless. But I asked that question, and her response to me was, well, if I tell you that, you're just going to spend it. And my response to her, and this is probably why I lost the business, was, yes, that's the point of a budget. Throw my hands in the air. Yeah. And she looked at me very angry. And I said, if it makes you feel better, tell me your budget is 20% less than it is actually, and then I'll provide services to that budget, which is pointless, because I know it's 20% more, and I'm going to. Why do we lie to each other? Why do we play these games? Most of my most successful clients in my 20+ year career, we've had very open and honest, transparent conversations about budget. And that's why it's in the event canvas, to bring this stuff up and have the conversation, because not having the conversation only widens that chasm. And if you can't trust your partners to respect your budget, to work with you in your budget, they're the wrong partners for you, and you're going about forming partnership relationships in the wrong way.
Absolutely. And coming back to that shared language and understanding as well, I'm yet to work with any sort of AV company or supplier to an event who doesn't want to do a really good job. They want to do the best job possible. And I know for a fact, when I've given budgets to people and said, look, there's your budget, that's what I need sound, light, I know that they always say, we've thrown a few extra boxes of stuff onto the truck. We've just invested in these new lights. We want to get them out. We want to see what they look like. These companies have a professional pride in what they do and what they deliver. And if you actually give them a budget and you're honest about that budget, what I've found is, in most circumstances, you'll actually get more than what your budget on paper would actually get from that company on their price list. That's how these companies work.
Now imagine this. Imagine you as the event owner or the event designer or the event planner, whatever title you want to put on yourself. Imagine you have a one-page narrative that explains exactly how the event represents value to its stakeholders. And you deliver that to your suppliers and your providers and say, hey, love your recommendations, love your solutions and your products within our budget, within the constraint outlined in that conversation or the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Now read this and know that this is our North Star. This is where you as my supplier and my partner in delivering this event, this is what we need to achieve. Then come back to me with technology. So if you have a new light and you want to throw it in, great, I'm all for it. Does it achieve the narrative? Does it create the change that the event, does it contribute to creating the change that the event needs to be? Otherwise, you're putting extra stuff on my show for no reason, whether you're charging me for it or not. Yeah. And you should be able to say, as the tech provider, whether it's a platform, whether it's software or hardware, you should be able to go back to the client and say, hey, I'm helping to contribute to this goal of your event because I understand your narrative. Now, so often RFPs go out to suppliers that give very vague overviews of what the event is and what it's for, very, very high level. And they put one paragraph saying, we want 3 different ideas from you and it's got to have wow factor. Now, wow factor isn't an outcome.
But I've gone wow at many mistakes at events.
Exactly, yeah.
What is wow factor? Because there's been many times where something has completely gone to rat shit, and you go, wow.
And
wow is not always a good thing.
This also grinds our gears in the Event Design Collective. The other thing that every supplier thinks that they need to ask clients is they go into a meeting and they say, what are the objectives of this event? Right? It's just kind of that's been the running talk track for many years now. Tell me what the objectives of the event are. Events don't have objectives. Stop saying it. They never have objectives and they never will have objectives. The stakeholders who attend the events have objectives. Right? Events on their own can't bring about any change and can't improve anybody's life in any way unless they're directly linked to the change that occurs for those stakeholders. And we need
so you're facilitating the objectives of your stakeholders.
Correct. Yeah. The event is a tool, a mechanism to create change for those stakeholders as they are associated with the event. The objectives of the event don't exist.
So that's the stakeholders are an audience at a gig, or the exhibitors at a trade show, or the delegates at a conference seeking to enhance their education and understanding of a particular industry that they may be working in.
Do you want to know how we define an event?
Please do.
We just refined it in our latest book, which is Design to Change. Which, if the first book, the Event Design Handbook, was about the methodology and the language, the new book's about the conversations you have to have about events. And so we really looked at, okay, what is an event again, because we defined it one way and we evolved it a little bit in the second book. But basically, we define an event as being any gathering of 2 or more people or groups of people who have something at stake, or we could call them a stakeholder, and their behaviors changed. So they have to be transformed in some way. Otherwise, it's some sort of gathering. It's not really an event, because an event, we believe, is a marker of change over time. When you look back and go, hey, I attended something that was big and impactful, whether it's a concert or whether it's a conference or a yoga retreat, or even an anniversary dinner with my wife at a nice restaurant, we all in those scenarios have something different at stake as it relates to the event. And we have all come out of that experience changed in some way. I'm closer to my wife after celebrating that scenario. I'm more relaxed because of my yoga retreat, or I learned something at a conference. There's some transformation going on there. So if it only needs 2, and obviously most events have more than just 2 stakeholders, but if that's the low bar of entry for understanding an event, you can certainly see that there's many opportunities to design more impactful change, and to recognize that we need to connect with those stakeholders, whoever they might be, through all those levels of hierarchy, interest, and power, to make sure that even the smallest moments, the dinner of 2 people, or the 20, 60, 100,000 person conference or concert, will bring about some change.
And this brings us full circle, as we sort of come rattling through to the end of today's chat and today's podcast, to the whole need to get the design element right, and why your event canvas method will work for people, because they've then got something that they can present and use to talk to all of those stakeholders, clients, suppliers, contractors, whoever they're bringing in to help facilitate the delivery of their event. That event canvas is going to help them communicate the correct message to the right person.
Correct. And start that work up front. Don't let it be messy and confusing the whole way through. From strategy through to execution and post-mortem. The less structure and less process we have through how we create events, the more distractions come in from left, right, and center as different stakeholders contribute their wants. By putting that effort, by assigning time, team, and space to design before you get into planning, before you really start to put, cross the T's and dot the I's, like all planners love to do, you put that energy and effort up front to make sure that the design part really addresses this deep, intimate understanding, both of the change and the frame. And then when you move into prototyping, you get one, we want to have multiple options. So you want to prototype more than one event option for people. And by the way, not having an event is always a viable prototype. Cancel the event, right? So by designing multiple, we're more likely, when the event owner looks at multiple prototypes, to go, I think that one resonates with us. I really like that element. Let's go ahead with that, and let's measure through the execution if we achieve that change, so that next time we do less design work up front because we did the hard work this year, and we can start to iterate and start to improve on those stakeholder outcomes.
Absolutely. We've been talking on the podcast today with Anthony Vade, certified event designer, as we have learned in the early part of today's podcast, but more importantly, director North America for the Event Design Collective. And I always know a great episode of this podcast, I mean, they're all great in their own little way, but when I've not looked at the clock at all and I glance over it, as I did about a minute ago, and go, crikey, we're way over time. But as I said, that's always a good sign, because that means we've been chatting, we've been talking, we've been concentrating on the content of this conversation, and it's been great to talk to you. And it's also one of those where I kind of feel a little bit aggrieved that I've got to wrap it up, because I feel like there's so much more that we could talk about. But this is your first time on the podcast, Anthony, so we'd love to have you back on again. Let's stay in touch and come and talk to us again about some of the stuff that you guys are up to, because it's been fascinating to find out, even that little bit of what you guys can do. And I feel it's really important, before we do wrap up, to once again reference the video version of this podcast. If you're listening to it, fantastic, but hop over to eventindustrynews.com, and we're going to pop a few banners on screen now, just with some stuff, useful links. Anthony, perhaps you can talk us through some of these. First of all, we've got the download link there for edco.global.
Yeah, look, we are really passionate about getting this methodology in front of people. So if they go to this edco.global/download link, you can download a Creative Commons version of the event canvas to start exploring it. And we'll even give you the first 100 pages of the Event Design Handbook to help you understand that canvas and start to think about deploying it. So that's all free of charge. You can do it today. It's pretty much instant access to those resources.
Fantastic. And the next little link that we've got for people is at AV Connecting. Presumably this is for all of the social media feeds, Twitter, Instagram, things like that, Anthony.
Yeah, so that's where I exist on social media. I'm on pretty much every channel. I'm a bit more diligent with some than others, but I'm always dropping out extra content there. You can keep up to date on my different speaking engagements around the world as well. So there's a big repository of different content on all those channels that you can dig through. And please connect with me, follow me, reach out. Let's continue this conversation around this content on social media.
Fantastic. And the final links that we're going to pop up on screen now is hashtag event canvas and at design to change. Again, social media hashtag there, but tell us a little bit about at design to change, Anthony.
Oh, actually, sorry, that's hashtag design to change.
Hashtag design change, my fault.
Yeah. So basically hashtag event canvas is the tag we use for all of our event canvas practitioners around the world. So they all share their different designs and their different processes. So we really collaborate on that hashtag around the actual doing of the event canvas. And it's a great little collaborative space. So tons of content online to explore there. And Design to Change is aligned with the new book. So there's a lot of new content coming out. And as I said, that's about the conversations you need to have with event owners, with executives, and how do we talk about the outcomes we create our process so that it really resonates with people. So if you check out Design to Change, there's actually designtochange.online, which we've put out with the book as well, which has a whole layer of omni-channel experiences. So if you get a copy of this book, not only do you get the hard copy of Design to Change to read, it's got augmented reality layer on top of it. It's got an audiobook format that you get for free, and there's a full podcast series and video interview series that goes along with it as well. So like there's so much content that it's almost too much for everybody out there to dip their feet in. But if they visit that edco.global/download, that's a good starting point.
Fantastic. And who says that we don't offer great value on this podcast here? There you go. Loads of stuff for people to follow up on today, but loads of really good stuff and loads of stuff that is undoubtedly going to help people with their own progressions. You know, we're in a challenging but a really opportunistic time, I feel, for the event industry now. You know, we're at, you know, a new dawn. You know, there's all sorts of cliches being thrown around, but they're cliches for a reason, because that you know, they're true. There are loads of great opportunities for people to maybe reset their old ways of thinking, to look at new ways, new ideas to inspire them in how they put together and design their events. And Anthony, it's been great to get a little bit of insight into how you guys help those organizers to do that. And I would urge all of our podcast followers today to go and check out some of those links that the guys have been good enough to share with us and find out what they can do to help. Of course, if you are listening, as I've said several times today, you're listening to this, and it's great to have you on board. We hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, but do go and check out the video versions of this and all of our other podcasts over at eventindustrynews.com. And of course, if you have been watching this today on the video stream on eventindustrynews.com, first of all, I feel I need to seriously up my home podcast studio game, because I'm being massively outshone in recent episodes by the quality of some of the guests and the setups that they've got. And Anthony has absolutely, you know, crushed me today. I'm going to have to get some better screens behind me. I'm going to go big on the production values going forward. So keep your eyes peeled. And we should also say a big hello this afternoon to Mabel the dog, who has joined me again on the podcast. She often sits in on these. She loves learning about what's happening in the events industry. And as you can see today, she's particularly excited about today's topic. So yes, thanks again for being joined by Mabel the dog. Thanks guys for listening. Anthony has been joining us from Toronto in Canada. It's been great to have him on board, and I'm going to see everybody again on the next issue of the Event Industry News podcast. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.